Hello and welcome to the Tulsa Times podcast. I'm Patrick McNicholas, the artist and researcher behind Time Travel Tulsa, and as always, I'm joined with local historian and friend John Beasley. In this show, we discuss Tulsa's past, present, and future, so sit back and relax as we talk Tulsa Times. Well, welcome back, and thanks for joining us for the third edition of the Tulsa Times podcast. It's officially spring here in Oklahoma, March 2022. Patrick and John here, of course, but we'll have a Tulsa Times first in today's episode. We'll have our first podcast guest that will join us a little bit later, and we'll discuss history, photography, lost restaurants, and, of course, our main topic, Route 66, and who's the person that comes to mind when you think of those combination of things?
None other than Tulsa's own Rhys Martin.
And but we have some big news about the podcast, of course. You can find us anywhere you get your podcasts, and you know a lot of people say that, but what does that really mean? That means we're on platforms like Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google, TuneIn, Pandora, and many more. All you have to do is search it, Tulsa Times Podcast, and you'll see all the episodes listed there. So be sure to like, follow, subscribe, and that'll keep you up to date with the latest episodes. But the last episode, which was episode 2, pretty long, longer than most of our planned episodes, but we had a lot of people interested in the oil and gas parts, which we didn't realize would become such a major topic, nationwide or worldwide events and whatnot. But, keep letting us know what kind of topics you're interested in.
Yeah, we've got some great ideas submitted so far. And we're always thinking about new topics, but we want to know what you want to learn more about.
And as always, we'll start with the recent happenings and latest developments happening around town. And first off, I want to say be sure to grab the Life Senior Services magazine this month. You can find it right outside of or coming inside Rhees's, Walgreens, other places. A pretty big print. And some of the time travel artwork as far as Tulsa landmarks is featured in that. And the Driller, John's favorite, the Spotlight, and even the Warehouse Market, which again we're going to be mentioning Route 66 coming up, but that has Bob Wills's touring bus, which is outside and going to be renovated for OK Pop. But also in the Tulsa People, check that out, Southwestern Bell Building, and not out yet, but Vandever, so be on the lookout for that.
Yeah, over the past few years, we've seen several of our older downtown buildings that have been converted into residential. As a former environmental activist, love seeing that. The greenest building is that's already built. No need to knock the old Vandever building down, haul all that off only to try to recover new materials to build one. Former Adams Hotel, the YMCA is a great example, and more recently the Reunion Building, which I know you have spent some time in. But the Vandever's Lofts were amongst the first in downtown Tulsa. It opened as a residential building in 2014, and when it opened, it was at 100% capacity. So that really showed the developers that there is a desire for more downtown living space.
We are speeding towards warmer weather. Like I said, it's spring here officially in Tulsa, but Tulsa's known for those annual events like Mayfest, and we have a lot of things coming up, but we just had St. Patty's in multiple locations, but I went to the one on Cherry Street, and we were there for the first time in 2 years, first time that it was held in 2 years.
Yeah, I'll always remember our last event before the COVID shutdown. You and I took that Outsiders bus and drove in the 2020 Mardi Gras parade, had a great time, had no idea what was about to happen with COVID.
Yeah, we were going on 7 months of doing those tours, and that was literally like kind of the last hurrah, because we had probably I know we did some tours either early that day or that same weekend, but they asked us to be in the parade, and that was the first parade that I was a part of. Really, I mean that in a while, I guess, but. Yeah, so we're looking forward to more fun things happening downtown, and Guthrie Green will start having weekly events there next week. And then, of course, sports in Tulsa is going to be hopping up. Athletics play later tonight, actually, as of the recording of this. The Drillers will start next month, which we're basically at the end of March now, and then Oilers are coming to a close, and they're right on the edge of a playoff spot, so they're hoping to get maybe 1 or 2 more wins and put them into that playoff push. But Adam Pleskatch, who's been a player that they've had for I think almost 18 seasons, he just had his 581st game, and that's a record for the Oilers.
True Tulsa. # True Tulsa.
And he's a Canadian guy who kind of is a transplant. You know, he kind of found Tulsa as home, and he's been living here, like I said, for quite some time, and really kind of fell in love with Tulsa and the history of the Oilers, which goes back to 1928. But the Athletics, who used to be the Roughnecks, playing on a new field over at Hicks Park, 34th and Mingo, and they're actually going to be paying. They're going to be paid events, so they're going to actually have attendees that will pay a small fee in order to view those. They used to be at Boulder Park, but some other things to look forward to that are going to be coming up. Route 66, Histories of America's Main Street, opens next week at the Tulsa Historical Society. And something that I was lucky enough to visit before it came here to Tulsa, the Beyond Van Gogh immersive experience. I saw that in Vegas, and really quite the experience, to say the least.
So many good things coming up in Tulsa. And after the past 2 years of the pandemic, we all deserve a fantastic summer of 2022. The church studio is now officially open. We've talked about that in a couple of previous episodes, and I just happened to, one of the things I love about this town, it's a small town in many ways. You never know who you're going to run into. Had the pleasure of meeting Carlos Turrentine, who was a horn player for the Gap Band back in the 70s, recorded there in the church studio in 1975. And I had the honor of taking him up to the church studio, where he got to meet with Teresa Knox and share some stories and take a look and share some memories of his time there at the church studio. So again, now officially open to the public, so you too can take tours of Leon Russell's church studio.
And other things not available to the public yet, but underway, is season 2 of Reservation Dogs. And the shooting, they just started the other morning with a native song and a native prayer before the shooting began. And so I thought that was kind of cool, just some word through the wire of people that are on that and taking part of the shooting. But something that you know about, TFA getting a grant from the Oklahoma Historical Society to digitize a handful of items from their collection.
Oh my, it's more than a handful. Yeah, I've been involved with Tulsa Foundation for Architecture for 7-8 years now, both as a tour guide and on their archives committee. And wow, are there a lot of archives. Love working in the archives. You never know what you're going to come up with, and it's going to be a fantastic resource for all once we get these blueprints, these other materials that we have there in the archives digitized, so they are available online.
And something else you're familiar with, you've been over near the Gathering Place area, and you keep seeing the continued progress on the pedestrian bridge, and I keep seeing people post some great photos of both the old and new bridge still standing. I guess they're going to let that stand as long as they can.
I think it's a weather thing.
Oh.
On the days that we have had good days, it's been very windy. They need a crane to remove the rest of that. The crane has been on site for a couple of weeks. I am now there pretty much daily. Kind of an update since our last podcast. I did accept a part-time position as host there at Gathering Place. Love being there. We just had the best spring break ever at Gathering Place. But yeah, it does provide me that opportunity to be on site and to watch those bridges every day.
And to watch the dogs not come into the park, right?
Right? That is the worst part of the job. No, I'm sorry. You have to go. It's very clear on the website, very clear on the sign. Oh, Patrick, don't get me started. Yeah, please don't bring your dog. If it's a service animal, have their vest on and come on and see us. But yeah, don't just bring your dog to Gathering Place. I will say, except Wednesdays. Wednesday is Wags Wednesday, I think is what we're calling it. The dog in the park, bark in the park, something like that. But Wednesdays, please bring your dog out for a visit to Gathering Place.
They need like a rollerblading Tuesday or something too, and then maybe. But no, so other news in Tulsa, mixed feelings, of course, but progress nonetheless. The announcement of electric car maker Canoe to create a technology hub, quote unquote, in Tulsa. But I mean, the headline itself is its own conversation, but we also have to mention, the progress that Tulsa's made so far.
Yeah, we are energy industry and transportation. That's, from our founding with the Frisco Railroad coming through town in the 1880s, the Discovery Oil in the early 1900s. Tulsa's largely about transportation and energy. And as of now, there are already more than 250 public charging stations in Tulsa, including at the Gathering Place, at the Central Library, at many of the downtown parking garages. You can charge your electric vehicle, including one of your old favorites, the KC Auto Hotel, has been brought into the 21st century.
What is old is new, as they say, and that feeds right into our other news. Recycling and transfer facility back opening, recovering from a fire from a small battery that destroyed the place. But it was crazy to see that they process 8.4 millions of pounds of recycling a month at that location.
That is fantastic. Good for Tulsa. Mm-hmm. It's been a long time coming.
And also conversations about a new stadium, FC Tulsa, the Evans Fin Tube site. And, mixed feelings on this as well, but there's a planned community meeting about that on April 5th, and we'll see and learn more about that. But also note to progress, the flood insurance update. According to the mayor, we went from the worst flood-prone city in the entire country to one of the best protected. And a lot of that goes into property damages and some of the worst flooding that happened in John's neighborhood, Riverview.
Yes, as a resident of Riverview, I am very grateful for the City of Tulsa's Stormwater Department, some great folks in that department. And also recognize the citizens of Tulsa who have continually voted for those infrastructure improvements. And yes, making my neighborhood much safer. Thanks, y'all.
And I know we're talking spring, but we did have some last-minute snow. It came and went pretty quickly. But one thing that we did just figure out, or I just learned, was Oklahoma was named the lightning capital of the United States. So I need to get out there more often for those time lapses, I guess. Thanks to John, it's official. We're announcing our guest for the next episode. And who is that?
Yeah, so it's going to be April, and time to talk baseball. And there's no one better in Tulsa to talk Tulsa baseball than local historian Jake Cornwell. He's the founder of the Oklahoma Baseball Archives, and Jake's master's thesis was about Negro League baseball in Oklahoma. So excited to have Jake Cornwell, the horsehide historian, join us for our next podcast, the April podcast.
And that's something to look forward to next time. But with no further ado, I want to introduce our guest for this episode. He's a Tulsa author and photographer, and he's traveled all 2,448 miles of Route 66 and beyond, of course. His travel writings have been featured in several publications, alongside his photography, they kind of go hand in hand. And his book, of course, Lost Restaurants of Tulsa, which you can find in multiple locations, showcases 50 iconic eating establishments from Tulsa's past and tells the rich history of each of those. And of course, he's the president of the Oklahoma Route 66 Association and serves on the board of several other local and national Route 66 organizations. And we welcome in Rhys Martin.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks for joining us and being a part of the podcast. And I think one of the things that your bio doesn't mention is the blog that has kind of come together, going all the way back to February 2008 to present of content.
It's hard to think that it's been that long. I originally created that blog to catalog my travel when I left the country, and to share my experiences and my pictures with friends and family back home.
Yeah, and, a lot of us at that time, we were kind of doing online blogs and stuff, but like most people, I didn't keep up with it, but you did, and we can kind of see how it's evolved into who you are, in the Route 66 aspect. But like you said, you started this as a trip across the country or trip across the world.
Yeah, I call it my quarter life crisis. I had kind of hit a wall in my job and my first marriage, and I didn't know what I wanted to do with the rest of my life. So my first wife and I, we sold everything and we left the country and lived out of a backpack for 10 months, traveling through Southeast Asia and Europe. Took a container ship from Long Beach, California to New Zealand. I had never seen the ocean before at 28 years old, and then spent 2 weeks on it. And let me tell you, cargo ships don't have stabilizers like the cruise ships do. But once I got past that, experience of a lifetime. And I got home before my 30th birthday and saw Tulsa completely differently after that. I had developed a love for writing and for photography, and that's when I started really paying attention to the story of Tulsa and Oklahoma and Route 66.
As you know, I'm a big fan of the Mother Road, the history, the stories, the people. In fact, I think I have in my collection your first calendar.
You do?
From Route 66. Yeah. So I've been exploring Route 66 since probably the mid-'90s. I remember when Michael Wallace's documentary came out, and that was my first kind of experience or exposure to, followed by his book from 1990, and then the Jim Ross guidebook, which, was just amazing. So being a public school teacher, had limited discretionary funds for travel. So me and the kids, we'd load up in the minivan, state parks, and then specifically Route 66. And using Jim Ross's book as a guide, we were all over the state and saw so many great things, and really sparked that interest to know more about Route 66 and me and the kids. But so what was it that sparked your interest in Route 66?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, coming home with a love of photography and learning more about our history, I started to look around, and the Meadow Gold sign had moved that used to be at 11th and Lewis. I didn't realize it had moved to 11th and Peoria. I had just driven down there, saw it was gone, and lamented the fact I'd never taken a picture of it. I'd lost my opportunity. It was just gone, and I was an idiot. And then when I realized that, oh, no, wait a minute, there it is, just down the road, it's like, okay, so what's this whole Route 66 thing about? And it was 2013, so really not that long ago, that I took my first trip focused on Route 66, just a day trip up to Miami to see the Coleman Theater. And after that, I was hooked.
Yeah, you were. Once you found that passion, you were all in. So, you have served on a number of boards, committees, etc. Since that time. But what was your first volunteer experience on Route 66?
Oh, boy. The first experience I had that was part of that kind of community, I wasn't a volunteer at it because I didn't really know, what it was about yet, but I drove up to Lebanon, Missouri for the first rally for people to call attention to the Gasconade River Bridge. which is an old three-truss bridge that crosses the Gasconade River that was closed by the Missouri Department of Transportation, which the Missouri Association, Route 66 Association, is still trying to save. But that's where I met folks like Jim Ross and Roman Rich and all these names that are big into the Route 66 community.
Yes.
I was just a guy with a camera introducing myself to people.
Yes. And that, that hunt and, you mentioned the regret of not getting that Meadow Gold sign earlier. And that's one of the things that drives me in my photography as well, and the things that I want to see and get pictures of before it's gone. And of course, Patrick's specialty is finding photos of those things that are gone and then bringing us more up to date on those. While we talk about, and we're going to talk a lot about the history and important dates of Route 66, the physical infrastructure, for me, Route 66 is all about the people. So on my father's side of the family, and I'm a fifth generation Oklahoman, but I have some family that lives in California. So we've been on the route since the early days, including during the migration. I have family in California that moved there as agricultural workers, part of that Okie migration where tens of thousands of Oklahomans fled the state during the Great Depression, and then later as oil field workers headed to the fields north of Bakersfield. So, yeah, you'll find a few Beasleys there in California that I am related to. So it's those connections, not only between Oklahoma and California, but it's the fact that it's the Route 66, that we have, as Beasleys, have literally traveled for generations, that makes those connections and makes the route more than just that physical infrastructure, but a true connection on many levels.
But once you actually get out there, you think it's just one road that connects it. But once you get mile after mile, you realize how broad and how expansive it really is. And what Oklahoma has the most miles of the route, right?
We have the most drivable miles of any state. And that's something you'll see. Every little community seems to have a different little part of Route 66 they hang their hat on. They're the certain gateway, or they have the tallest this or that. And when you look at the different mileage counters, Oklahoma, New Mexico, and Arizona are all very close to one another. But when you account for all the different alignments and things like that, and especially today, Oklahoma's got more drivable miles. We have over 400.
So when people say alignments, what does that really mean? Because I know that we hear that a lot.
Sure, and it's a great question. So when Route 66 was first established in 1926, it basically cobbled together a bunch of existing roads to create the path from Chicago to Los Angeles. Over the years, that road has changed, and so the alignment has changed. Probably the biggest one that came early was in New Mexico, when Santa Fe was removed from the alignment. So instead of jogging north to Santa Fe and then back down, it just cut straight across to Albuquerque. And so here in Tulsa, our original alignment was on Admiral, at the time was Federal Drive. And then in 1932, the bridge over Mingo Creek was finished. And so they just continued heading into town west on 11th Street like most people know it today.
Memories, what kind of, I remember specifically being in the Kendall Whittier district and playing a music venue that was right next to Pancha Anaya Bakery. That was definitely only a music venue for a short amount of time, but there were other places. Kendall Whittier obviously had its own reputation.
So Kendall Whittier, and I know there was some discussion when we were putting together a tour for Tulsa Foundation for Architecture, exactly where that original alignment was, because there were some indications it may have been, on 1st or 3rd maybe, before ultimately it ended up on 11th. Any ideas about Kendall Whittier's place? I know it would have been from, 26 to 32, that
right.
It would have gone around the very large corner of Admiral and Lewis.
So it depends on the map you look at. Forever, the recognized alignment of Route 60, the original Route 66, came in on Admiral, went down to 2nd, and went into downtown that way. That's how it's signed today. However, there are some local maps from Tulsa from that time period that show it continuing on Admiral into downtown until you get to about the Kenosha area. But the thing is, some maps at the state level don't necessarily take local feedback. They just said, oh, this is what we have. Local maps, you think, would have the jurisdiction, I guess you could say, over what is the route and what isn't. I'll just say it's kind of a hot topic and something that the Tulsa Route 66 Commission is digging into to see if we can say with as much finality as possible which street was it that Route 66 came into downtown. But officially, it is still 2nd Street.
And over there we have Station 473, which is original Phillips 66 station and still holds the name. But we're going to go through some kind of recent updates with the route and then get into some of the history. And I know you said the Route 66 Commission, and you guys have been working in Tulsa alone on the neon signs, relighting those. And how many have you guys had now?
We just had number 38, get turned on in the last couple of weeks.
And business, anybody can be a part of this, or is it
any business that's on Route 66, either alignment, is eligible for the grant program. It's a 50% matching grant up to $10,000. So if you want to add a new neon sign and it's going to cost you $7,000 once it's installed and everything, this Route 66 Commission will cut you a check for $3,500.
So that's where that discussion of the alignment comes into play, right? Because the one that comes to mind immediately is Thelma's.
Yeah.
You know, the Thelma's bar sign. Mm-hmm. So did that qualify?
It did, and the reason it did is because when we were putting together the grant program, we worked with city zoning to put an overlay in place, which also relaxed some of the signage restrictions that came into place in the 1970s with the so-called beautification movement and that kind of thing.
Right.
So when we looked at everything, 2nd Street is all residential. They would not get any benefit from the neon grant program.
Correct.
And so we made, I would say, an executive decision at the commission level to put that zoning overlay down Admiral.
Yes.
Because there are businesses that would benefit from it, and there was an argument that was actually original Route 66. So Thelma's was eligible for that grant.
I think, seeing the businesses like, what is now the brewery in the area, certainly he mentioned, 473, that cottage style of Phillips Station. It's those kinds of things that indicate to me that was more likely Route 66.
And that's where the question started, is like, wait a minute, well, this is a service station. There was no service station on 2nd Street. Why would you build an automobile-focused business on not the route when it's right there? And so that's what got people started to question, and I'm very happy that we've found some evidence that indicates that might be the case. But again, these wheels move slowly.
And neon has been associated with Route 66 since its heydays when people would travel out to Disneyland on vacation and such.
And I did some quick research on neon, and that would have been, 1930s area, that it would have been very popular and also novel. And that's where we end up seeing it. Of course, one comes to mind. What is it? Shamrock, Texas, or what's the gas station with all the green?
Oh, yeah, that is Shamrock, Texas. That is the U drop in Shamrock. But that's LED now. Because the beautiful Art Deco service station on Route 66 in Shamrock, Texas, had all this amazing neon added to outline their building, and it looked gorgeous, and then they had a hailstorm, and it broke all the glass.
Yes.
So when they redid everything, they did it in LED, which the external LED tubing like that, you'll talk to neon purists, and I totally get it, that absolutely not, but it's not as pliable. You don't get as many colors as you do with neon, and it doesn't have that kind of historic quality that real neon does. But there are some cases, like with the Conoco you drop in there, that it just made more sense for them. So it's better than it just being like a plastic box sign or something.
Yeah, and I mean, it's safe to say that Tulsa has the most neon, though, right? I mean, I've been to a few of the lighting ceremonies.
We have a lot. We looked to, when the grant was being put together, we looked to Albuquerque as a town that we wanted to emulate, because they also had a grant program. The National Park Service had a national grant program that was a matching grant for various projects. And so I don't know that I could sit here and confidently say Tulsa has more neon than any other Route 66 town. I mean, how could we have more neon than Los Angeles, for example? But I would say we have more energy behind making neon part of our Route 66 experience here.
I think a great example of that is the neon sign park that you find on the west bank of the Arkansas River, traveling over Southwest Boulevard as you parallel the Cyrus Avery Memorial Bridge. And quick plug for my YouTube channel. I do have an episode because I was there with y'all for the lighting ceremony for that. So yeah, you can find some video of that lighting ceremony on my YouTube episode titled Riverview Neighborhood and Route 66.
And other developments happening along the route. Of course, Mother Road Market's been there, but there's been a lot of construction on that, northwest corner that they're going to be putting in an addition to that 1939 grocery store that was renovated to become the Mother Road Market. And that's 20 different individual businesses, I believe.
I don't remember the number, but it's this great food hall where it's all local entrepreneurs that are serving all kinds of different foods for you to try, especially for a Route 66 traveler. If you're from Europe and you started in Chicago, by the time you get to Oklahoma, you're probably getting tired of fried food everywhere you stop. But you can go into Mother Road Market and you could get sushi, or you could get Cuban food, or maybe there's a native pop-up in the Takeover Cafe. And it's just a great experience for people, not just travelers, but for Tulsans.
Yeah, you get a lot of local flavors, with everybody being local. So get some grub and some Tulsa gear, Route 66 gear. There's some places to shop in the Mother Road Market as well. And
for those putt-putt enthusiasts, too, there's a putt-putt course.
It is where you travel the route, right? Is it just in the Tulsa area?
No, they had Cadillac Ranch as one of them. There was one.
The Wigwam Motel. Yeah. It's from a little bit of everywhere, but it's got more Oklahoma than anywhere else.
But yeah, we're interested to see, and I've seen the renderings of that area, and it looks really, really great. And then, of course, other places along the route in Tulsa, the Cyrus Avery Plaza. We'll see what happens with that. We're still not really sure, but there's obviously been a lot of interest in that location.
Yes, with the Route 66 experience.
The experience
on Crybaby Hill.
And Crybaby Hill, of course, is kind of its own Tulsa landmark that it's become. But with those historic markers, and this is recent, there's 30 or almost 30 historic markers, and those give context if people were to get out of their car and be able to join the route.
Right. It's telling a little bit more of our story, as much as someone like myself would love to be out on a tour bus or in these places to be able to tell people about our history with Route 66 and the various things like Cyrus Avery and the Green Book and things like that. That's just not possible. But if you have a little place that can give just a tiny snippet of that story, hopefully it will encourage people to dig a little bit and learn more.
And we're going to mention kind of more history coming up, but we'll get through some of this more recent news. And some of that is Oklahoma recognizing its bicycling significance, and it makes part of the route bicycling route system, which connects with Missouri and Kansas, and they have their own kind of rails to trails type thing. My parents are big on that. But, the route has become, and again, we'll get into kind of after the decommissioning, but, in Tulsa specifically and in other places, it became kind of a rough area. But we've had those people, locals, champion and bring it back to life. And so that the broken windows that we experienced a few weeks ago was really just kind of something that we don't see very often at all. But, it used to be some kind of rough area that, it would be kind of more familiar with that.
It's interesting. My wife moved to Tulsa sight unseen in about 2006, drove down from New York State. And so she got off the highway and came up 11th Street towards TU and just thought, my word, what have I gotten myself into? Because it's empty lot, closed building, 3 car lots, church, empty lot, and it just was not in great shape. And to drive 11th Street now, it's night and day, and we still have nowhere to go but up.
And that's where we have people that have left for 10 years, that have went to the coast or went to elsewhere and now are returning in droves, because of how much has happened in a short amount of time. And that's kind of what I was talking about is, we celebrate our past and also kind of, even though we may not move at the same pace of other cities kind of looking towards the future, we're still trying to appreciate our past in that process. But let's talk a little bit about the total history of the route and how Tulsa played a major role, because that's kind of the whole point here is that, if it wasn't for Tulsa and some of the influences, the people that made this place, Route 66 really wouldn't be what it is or what we see today. And if you had to explain Route 66 to someone that has never even heard of it, I mean, how would you start?
Well, the context today is that Route 66 represents an era of American growth and prosperity that has become the world's largest open-air museum. You get to see, Michael Wallace famously says it's America before it became generic. But it's a great snapshot of that 20th century American road trip, and all the good and bad that's involved in that. But there's more to it than that. But hopefully that would get somebody in the door to say, okay, well, what was that experience like? And then learn about how it started and then how it developed into what it is today.
And I have to say, I have to admit myself, I grew up on the Jefferson Highway, once known as the Texas Road, and this predates 66 and was one of those roads, cattle road, that led towards one of the Civil War battles, Honey Springs.
One of the other early highways, if you will, to come through here was, of course, the Ozark Trail. And, I understand that Cyrus Avery had a part in that as well. And so Cyrus Avery is one of those guys that I like to talk about, not only with Route 66, and he was very influential in Route 66, and we'll get to that in a minute, but just in the development of Tulsa. Most Tulsans recognize those early oil barons, the names like Chapman and McFarland, Warren and Sinclair, Phillips, but I don't think there was any Tulsan more important to the development of this city than Cyrus Avery, who, again, I think does not get, although we've more recently, certainly come to recognize him with naming the memorial bridge over him, the old bridge that he as county commissioner, helped to build. Cyrus Avery Plaza, East meets West, is just up the hill from where I live, and I love it and am there often. But Cyrus Avery was early in oil. In fact, he was in Veneta, had a partnership with Sinclair, who, later became one of those great oil barons. But Avery kind of went a different direction when he came to Tulsa, bought a farm, and was at that point, on the outside of Tulsa. And his frustration was getting his product, his livestock, transported. So transportation, he knew that for Tulsa to be a successful city, we needed infrastructure. So whether we're talking roads, whether we're talking water, there's very little of what became of Tulsa that Avery didn't have a hand in, including that original Ozark Trail, which many of those, like you said, cobbled together became what later was Route 66.
Right. Ozark Trail, there's still markers up for that. And, along the Route 66 journey, Route 66 corridor. But, Cyrus Avery, people think Route 66. Exactly. But, to his last days, he said the project he was most proud of was the Spavinaw Pipeline project, which is what brought drinkable fresh water to Tulsa. And Tulsa still gets accolades on its water system. Before that happened, it was said that if you took a bath, then you had to stand up and dust off, not dry off, because of everything from the Arkansas River. The front page of the Tulsa World, once they got that completed, were people toasting champagne glasses of water on the streets. One of my favorite little thrift store finds was a postcard from Tulsa from before the pipeline, where the guy that's riding back home to Minnesota says, "I'm not even going to try fishing here. The water's got all these minerals in it. You can't even drink it. Everyone just drinks bottled water here." Just incredible. But of course, now Route 66 and Cyrus Avery are synonymous.
And that kind of makes me think, as me and you, photographers, our favorite piece of art is much different than what everyone considers to be. And I kind of see myself in Cyrus Avery in that Spavinaw project, which, again, once I learned about it and the fact that the president at the time had a turnkey in the White House in order to activate it. There's certain things that Tulsa history gets glossed over because of other connecting dots again. But like you were saying, most people recognize those names, but when it comes to Avery, it's kind of a different story. Of course, his home and his farm, they were located by the Route 66 Rising Monument, correct?
Yeah, out there by the Admiral Domingo area, he had a little gas station and restaurant. And on that early 1928 Tulsa Chamber map that I mentioned earlier, it's just got a little arrow pointing out east that says Avery Tourist Camp. So, yeah.
And that was kind of, I guess, one of the early kind of exiting point. I mean, because there were obviously lots of things like the Blue Whale, which, I guess kind of things to get you off the route. And a lot of times when people think interstates today, it's trying to get, I think people would say, I got there an hour before I was supposed to, that's a good thing. But it was obviously different in these days.
Yeah, nowadays I tell people the interstate is about getting somewhere and Route 66 is about going somewhere.
Nice. And so
I like that.
And so there's obviously this argument that we have with Springfield, and I know that Avery has a little bit to do with this, but Springfield, Missouri, and Tulsa have this ongoing who is the birthplace.
It's a fun debate,
Yeah, it connects us not only through the route, but through history and topics.
So Springfield is billed as the birthplace of Route 66 because that's where all of the federal highway commissioners gathered and settled the argument of what is the number going to be, because Kentucky took number 60 of this road from Chicago to L.A., and that's where the postcard was sent from Springfield, Missouri to Washington saying, all right, we're going to be 66. Tulsa has stood up and said, well, we're home of Cyrus Avery. We're going to be the capital of Route 66. And so you're starting to see that pop up.
So Cyrus Avery's role in both getting Route 66 through Tulsa and the naming of it 66, can you address some of those?
Sure. So if you put a map down and draw a line between Chicago and Los Angeles, it doesn't touch Oklahoma. And when they were looking at the way to establish this vital corridor between Chicago and Los Angeles, Cyrus Avery stood up and said, look, not only do we have some of these other established roads like the Ozark Trail, but there's this amazing brand new state-of-the-art bridge across the Arkansas River. It's the best way to cross the river. We should really go through Tulsa. He convinced everybody else, and that's why the route dips down through Missouri, through Oklahoma and Texas, instead of crossing across Nebraska and Kansas.
And that was a bridge that he helped to get built when he was county commissioner.
That's right. It replaced this old wagon bridge that had been in before that, this old truss bridge. And it's easy to think that if that bridge hadn't been updated when it was in the mid-19-teens, when oil was discovered in Glenpool, well, maybe Sapulpa would have been the oil capital of the world. It's amazing what ramifications they have later.
I guess some people would ask, there were a lot of highways. If there were 60 plus or I guess 90 plus highways across the country, why did Route 66 become more iconic than any of the others?
Well, first and foremost, it had its own promotional or association. Just a few years after, because all the highways that had got numbers got them all at the exact same time. The named highways were decertified. Suddenly, everything had a number, and so it stands to reason why 66. You've got all these other, all these other numbers out there. But Cyrus Avery also helped establish the U.S. Highway 66 Association to help promote the road in the interest of getting it paved quickly and getting boosters for it. And so it was one of the first fully paved highways in the United States. And when you think about, mud and weather and things like that, it certainly makes a difference when you're traveling on a paved road as compared to a dirt road through the country. And so that got it in, put it in a good place to be placed into popular culture early in the 1930s. You have John Steinbeck's great novel, Grapes of Wrath, that refers to it as the Mother Road. And it really was the road that migrant farmers used to go west to California seeking a better life. It was the road after the war that everyone went west to see the Grand Canyon and see the grandeur of our national parks. It had a TV show that was really popular. It was known as the Will Rogers Highway, even in the year after Will's death, even though that wasn't officially named Will Rogers Highway until the 1950s. And then on, and it's like a snowball rolling downhill. Eventually, everybody knew what Route 66 was, and now that shield is recognizable around the world as Coca-Cola or Mickey Mouse.
Mm-hmm. There were many highlights, different things that you could stop for, but there, like you mentioned, even before paved, there were a lot of lowlights. I mean, I'm sure there were traffic jam. I mean, at certain spots, the road wasn't much larger than some of our cars now, right? I mean...
Well, yes. There's a famous segment up near Miami called the Sidewalk Highway, which is only 9 feet wide because they only had the money. They're like, we can only pave either half of it or we can do it half as wide and get it from end to end. And they just assumed at that time if you happened to encounter another car, you could pull over to the side. But, a lot of old newspaper articles back in the day referred to it as Bloody 66 because people were driving faster than they'd ever driven before. The road curved with the land. And so that was... honestly, one of the reasons the interstate was so popular when it was designed is, you could get from A to B. It was straighter, it was safer, and you could drive faster. And so, but you're right. Like you had these traffic jams. There was no way around it. You had pedestrian underpasses in places. There's still one open up in Chelsea, not far from Tulsa, where that was the only safe way to cross the road was to walk under it. In Tulsa, there was one right over by 11th and Yale, and when I wrote Lost Restaurants of Tulsa, a lot of people said when they were a kid and they went to school at the elementary right there, they would go under the road to go get themselves some chicken.
Mm-hmm. And we mentioned that in the last episode, talking a little bit about the mines. We weren't sure if that connected at all, but there were other lowlights of the road.
You want to call it a lowlight. You had mentioned the Green Book. It was the Negro Motorist Green Book, and it was a travel guide for African Americans because, as we all know too well, the 1920s, Tulsa did not have a great reputation. And so there was a book developed and published as a travel guide for blacks to show them, what was safe for them, where they could find the services that they wanted or needed. We've got one, and you mentioned the markers. It's got a marker in front of it. It's now Red's Bar. That would be, 2nd and Elgin, somewhere in the Blue Dome district. That was a place, it was a service station back in the day. And that was a service station that would accommodate these people, because unfortunately, not every place along Route 66 was so accommodating in the 1920s and 30s.
Yeah, one thing I want to mention, speaking about the Green Book, is there's this amazing book that came out recently called Overground Railroad by Candace E. Taylor that I highly recommend for folks wanting to learn a little bit more about what that experience was like for Black Americans traveling. And there's a filling station in Luther, an old filling station called the Threat Filling Station, Threatt. That family is currently working to restore that station to kind of tell a little bit of that story. But it's not a good chapter of American history, but it's an important chapter to learn and understand and help ensure that, that kind of thing doesn't ever happen again.
Indeed.
But something that was a little too progressive for Route 66 was the Interstate Highway Act. And that really ended helped decommission the route in itself. And I know that you can mention a little bit more on that.
The Interstate Highway Act was, I would say, the first nail in the coffin for good old Route 66. Because President Eisenhower said, hey, you know what? It'd be really great for infrastructure and national defense if we had these big highways that went through. They were straighter, they were safer, you could drive faster. And as those roads kept getting cobbled together, much like the route was and built, those old roads weren't as attractive. In some areas, the interstate's completely obliterated Route 66, and you can't even try to drive it anymore because the interstate goes right over it. But if you know where to look, you can find the old road. It's about 83%, I think was the last number I saw, is still drivable.
I mean, you have communities that have gone through Herculean efforts to bring some of this back too, right? I mean...
Yeah, Seligman, Arizona is called the birthplace of historic Route 66 because Seligman is the home of Angel Delgadillo, who, when his town was bypassed, he stood up and said, this isn't right, we're still here. And traffic just went from amazing to zero overnight. And he lobbied and lobbied and lobbied and helped get a section of Route 66 in Arizona designated as a historic road. And a year after he was successful in getting that done, all 8 states had their own historic Route 66 association and started the movement that eventually has come into what we have now.
And I remember I had grandparents that lived in Amarillo, so we traveled I-40, the new route, I guess, as they say. But you could still see evidence of the original route. And then I have family in Santa Fe as well, and you take I-40 to Albuquerque to go north to Santa Fe. So the first revitalizations in Tulsa, was there a group of people that were... pushing for that, or was that part of the same group? Because I know Michael Wallace was a contributing factor during that period of time.
He's a transplanted Tulsan, and we are honored to have Michael Wallace calling Tulsa home. I'd mentioned earlier that 1994, I believe it was a documentary film that he did over Route 66. That was kind of my first exposure. We can talk about Cyrus Avery. We can talk about, a lot of the people involved. For me personally, Michael Wallace is like the godfather of Route 66. And I think a lot of what came, decommissioned in 85, and it was largely forgotten about by that point with the introduction of I-40, I-44, the interstate highway system. But so just a few years after it was decommissioned was when he published his first book. 1990, I believe it was when his first book came out. And Michael Wallace has done so much for the route. I mean, the route would not be what it is today without Michael Wallace. Firmly believe that. He's a worthy of an episode of his own because he's an interesting character outside of Route 66. One of my favorite interviews that I've read about Michael Wallace was done by next month's guest. Jake Cornwell did an article where he delved deep into Michael Wallace's journalistic background, including the time back in the day when Michael Wallace was hanging out with Andy Warhol and that bunch.
And I remember specifically, we were in one of the summers of Oklahoma, and the Cars movie was on, and we went in because we were trying to get some air conditioner. We were on that bicycle route, and that's when I realized, I put 2 and 2 together, that he was the voice actor for, what was it, the sheriff?
For the sheriff of Radiator
and so,
Springs.
I mean, I think a lot of people know him more in popular culture as that. That's kind of what pushed him.
Michael Wallace is the voice of the Mother Road.
And also kind of, one of the people, again, that helped with those revitalizations. But some of those landmarks, even since I've lived here, we've had the Brookshire Motel, which was to be put on the National Register, but didn't make it until that point, correct? Or
So the Brookshire Motel at 11th and Garnett is very sad. As preservationists, you can only do so much. If it's private property, it's ultimately up to the landowner what they want to do to help preserve these places. And Tulsa's lost a lot of its historic motels over the years along Route 66. We don't have a whole lot left. And that was one that the Tulsa Route 66 Commission and myself personally were very invested in trying to save the motel for revitalization, and then maybe try to save the sign.
and this hotel was located
11th and Garnett.
11th and Garnett.
Yep, Route 66 dates back to the 1940s, or I should say dated back to the 1940s. Ugh.
I remember covering the story of the fire that occurred.
Yeah. Oh, I mean, over the last few years of its life, it had several fires, and it just wasn't well taken care of, and the landowner just wasn't interested in any of the things we'd proposed. And now it's all gone. But the neon sign was saved by the Billboard Museum in Oklahoma City, and the hope is to use it as part of a neon sign park somewhere along Route 66 before the centennial.
And then on the polarized end of that perspective, we mentioned a few places that did take advantage of that. 473, Buck Adams, of course, which went over and beyond what it could have been, and bringing in that muffler man and just the attention to detail and the depth of the history. You could spend quite some time there and be able to talk about what Mary Beth has done.
Yeah, and that's where we get back into the people of the route. And Tulsa has a great collection. Obviously, we're sitting here with one of them, Rhys Martin, very influential on where we are today and moving forward. But, I'm a big fan of Mary Beth Babcock, and she now has a neighbor with William Franklin at Decopolis, and they have just done so much. Another one of my favorite Tulsans, Liz Huckleby, is now out at the Blue Whale. So they've got some new stuff going on there, right?
They do, yeah. The Blue Whale, built in 1972 by Hugh Davis as an anniversary present to his wife. She loved whale figurines, and I suppose that's just the next step, is a big, giant concrete whale. When I was young, driving from Claremore, or riding in the back seat, from Claremore to Tulsa, the whale was closed. It was overgrown. It was just this odd, creepy monster in the weeds. And thankfully, it was saved. It was not demolished. The Davis family came and was able to keep it up. And then last year, the city of Catoosa purchased the property, which was a big deal. Anytime a city or a municipality gets involved with a long-time roadside attraction, there's a lot of, hackles go up. What's going to happen? Are they going to turn it into a mini mall? And thankfully, so far, the city of Catoosa is doing a great job. They've done a lot of cleanup to it, and Liz Huckleby has now been installed as the park director, and she's been a longtime Route 66 advocate and fan of the road. So I'm looking forward to seeing what they're going to be doing.
And one of the locations that we mentioned earlier, the old location, or the old home of the Meadow Gold sign. And one thing we didn't mention was the other side of that intersection, the Hawk Dairy, which a lot of us historians have been wanting that building to become back to its, golden state. But you told me an interesting story about that Meadow Gold sign and why it was placed there.
Right. Yeah, it's kind of funny. It's one of those stories that it's a legend. So I can't attribute this to complete 100% truth, but what good story is. It sounds good, so I'm going to go with it. So the Hawk Dairy building is on the northwest corner of 11th and Lewis, still there. It's got a really unique shape, and that was the distribution point for Hawk Dairy milk ice cream. They even had a little ice cream parlor there at one time. Well, catty corner to that, over where the Shops at Motherwood Market is now, that's where the Meadow Gold office was. Early Cass, who was another early Tulsa pioneer that was involved with a lot of Tulsa's early development, was Meadow Gold manager for a time, and said, you know what, I want something to differentiate myself here. And so in 1934, he commissioned this gigantic neon sign. It is huge. Anybody that's seen it, it doesn't quite feel like, what is this huge thing doing here?
About 2 stories tall, yeah.
It's gigantic. But the legend is that he put it there and angled it like that in such a way so that the folks in the Hawk Dairy across the street had no choice when they looked out their window. They had to look at his bright blazing neon sign.
The competitors, yeah, that makes sense. I mean, the myth makes sense. But there's also, I mean, we have the Blue Dome, which, you know, used to be a part of the old route. And luckily I was able to go up into the dome about 5 years ago or so. And we were doing a photo shoot up there, but just being on the roof and everything. And an interesting part of that history used to be a 24-hour gas station, so you know you could stop at any time. I mean, was there a lot of people traveling 24 hours on the route, or was this a strictly daytime endeavor?
Not as much as you have now.
Yeah.
I mean, part of it is you didn't really have many 24-hour service stations. You run out of gas in the middle of nowhere, you're just going to have to take a nap, I guess. But yeah, it was opened in 1925 and was 24 hours, had pressurized air. The attendant slept upstairs in the dome, would come down and help out. And what's interesting now is that part of it was demolished, but if you go look at the Blue Dome now and then at Arnie's Bar, it's the same building. That was the office where you'd go in, and that's where the attendant would be during the day. So it's really interesting. And I know the Armstrongs that own it have dreams about fixing it up and making it look a little more like it did back in the day. But as all things, you know, we just wish them luck and hope that comes to pass.
And Route 66 Rising, as we mentioned earlier, that would have been Cyrus Avery's neighborhood, but there's really no evidence now.
Yeah, that area has changed so much. There's not anything there to indicate what it once looked like. Though, there's a postcard image of Cyrus Avery's service station that was there, and you can see that at the time the road, it wasn't quite a traffic circle, but it was a big four-way like it is today. So it has evolved into where it is, but no, unfortunately not.
But not too far from there, I was living not too far from Desert Hills, where Will Rogers Theater used to be, and that's still an empty parking lot. But Desert Hills is still lit up and going strong right there, and they have a 1950s vehicle, I think, parked right outside. And I know that some local filmmakers have used that as a prop to kind of do an ode to the Route 66. And that's kind of what's interesting, is that it's become historic enough that we have the next few generations taking part in the retelling of this story. But I mean, there's obviously certain things and unusual things, like we mentioned the blue whale, but the space capsule, as they call it, which is the cement. So tell us a little bit about some of the unusual, and I guess you could throw in Buck Adams in there as well, but you know, some unusual roadside attractions that almost you have to stop now.
Yeah, so the Winganon space capsule isn't directly on Route 66, but it's about 20 minutes from Afton, which is on Route 66. It was the business part of a cement mixer truck. It went off-road in the 1950s and fell over, and the cement hardened before they could get it moved, and they just figured, well, here you will stay. And so some locals painted it to look like a little NASA capsule, and it has fooled more than one person over the years, but it's a fun little place to stop. That's not too far off the route. Buck Adams, of course, those Muffler Man statues were created as like tire shop advertisements that would literally hold giant mufflers to kind of advertise the business and get people to patronize them. And they've become their own kind of travel beacon for people. When Buck Adams was installed and they had their big ceremony for it, people came from all over the United States to celebrate it, because these folks will drive to find these wherever they're at. It's hard to pick a favorite. I mean, I've driven the road from end to end, and I think of things like the Our Lady of Highways Shrine in Illinois, or Uranus, Missouri has a fudge factory with a whole bunch of stuff. That'd be a whole podcast.
I see pictures all the time.
Yeah, that continues to grow and change there. They're really, and like you said, people will drive from all over the United States. I mean, this is tourism dollars. You know, we get people not only from all over the United States, but all over the world that come through here just to throw a few bucks at William Franklin or Mary Beth Babcock.
Well, I think, obviously the route the route is has a huge future, and the happenstance, the fact that Tulsa is in this area, there's still a lot of opportunities, especially in the Red Fork and beyond. But if someone wanted to get into Route 66 today, what would be a starting point, or is there a place for people to kind of like, they want to bring back the past? Is there a starting point for those kind of people?
Well, in Tulsa, the medical district is the area that's really doing it right. You have a great concentration of all kinds of businesses. It's very walkable, lots of cool neon, both historic and new. Cool stuff like Buck Adams and Decapolis, great restaurants, including Ike's Chili, which is Tulsa's oldest operating restaurant. And so it's a great place to start and then branch out. If someone's wanting to travel Route 66, Williams, Arizona is probably the best preserved town. It was the last town that was bypassed by the interstate, actually, and they kind of kept everything as it is. It's the gateway to the Grand Canyon, so you kind of have that on their doorstep, but it's also just a really neat place to spend some time too. But we have a lot. I mean, if you're born and raised in Tulsa, the Blue Whale might feel like old hat, but it's one of the most famous landmarks on the entire road. The Round Barn down in Arcadia is a great place to go, and Pops is not far, and that's another newer attraction that feels like it's been there a lot longer than it has. I would encourage anybody that's interested in exploring Route 66 in the state to go out to OklahomaRoute66.com, which is the website for the Oklahoma Route 66 Association. We've got a ton of information there, and you can even get a trip guide from us that kind of gives you maps and all kinds of stuff to see and do.
And I guess as far as the future, is there anything on the horizon related with Route 66 that we should be looking forward to? I know that we'll have some more museums opening up in Tulsa and beyond, and a lot of the times Route 66 is involved in some way. Is there anything that we can look forward to immediately that comes to mind?
Well, the centennial of the road is in 2026. That's when the road turns 100, and you have a lot of different communities that are trying to figure out what they want to do to help celebrate that. OK Pop is in the process of opening here in Tulsa. I know they're going to have a Route 66 section. John earlier mentioned the great Bob Wills tour bus that is pictured outside of the Warehouse Market there on 11th, and it's even the picture on the historic marker there of that bus. And I know OK Pop is working to restore that bus to take people on tours, and I can't wait to see that going up and down Route 66.
Yes, and right across the street from the Cain's Ballroom. I mean, what a great place to keep that bus. So in the more immediate future, we have an event with Tulsa Foundation for Architecture. We do our second Saturday tours, and in May, for only the second time, we're traveling outside of Tulsa. Going to be going to Sapulpa, Dewey Avenue and Route 66. And I just love Sapulpa. There are, I think, like 52 contributing buildings to their nationally recognized historic district. And it is interesting. We talked about Cyrus Avery and the bridge and how, that was instrumental in the development of Tulsa, and how Sapulpa could have become the oil capital of the world without Cyrus Avery and some of these other early Tulsans. But so that left Sapulpa frozen in time. So their downtown, unlike ours, which our classic buildings were knocked down to build new modern office structures, you just couldn't do modern office work in some of these older buildings. And so some of the old hotels, and things that we've demolished, those kinds of things are still there in Sapulpa. So again, we're talking about the future. I'm talking about a more immediate future. It will be May 14th. Tulsa Foundation for Architecture will be traveling down Route 66 to Sapulpa.
And the exhibit at the Tulsa Historical Society opens, is going to already be open by the time this airs, I imagine.
Yeah, America. Well, actually, it'll be coming up next week, beginning of April, and that will be America's Main Street. And definitely go check out the Historical Society because they have more than just that there. So we'll leave you with this question: what is your favorite stop along the route? leave it in the comment section below. And if you like this podcast, be sure to give us a follow and a like. That will do it for this edition of the Tulsa Times podcast. I'm Patrick McNicholas, and I'm joined with...
I am John Beasley, and a big thanks to our special guest,
Rhys Martin. Thank you for having me.
And if you have any thoughts, questions, ideas, be sure to reach out. That's either social media, Tulsa Past, or tulsapast.com. I want to give a big shout out to Jimmy, our audio engineer, our guest Rhys Martin, our listeners, and Park Grove Community Church in Red Fork, who I've been working with, that allowed us to use one of these extra microphones to record. And we'll be back with another guest next month, and that'll be local baseball historian Jake Cornwell. So
go Drillers!
Go Drillers! And thanks for listening to the third episode of the Tulsa Times podcast. This was Route 66 with Rhys Martin, and we'll be back again soon.